Good evening, friends, and welcome to St. Thomas More's online video series in honor and celebration of Black History Month. This event is brought to you by St. Thomas More's Image and Likeness Committee, a ministry that yearns to promote a culture of racial healing and reconciliation within the parish and beyond. This month, we celebrate Black history, and the Image and Likeness Committee is very excited to bring in Dr. Noelle Pratt from Villanova University to discuss the importance of creating our own narrative through research and the Black Catholic syllabus. I also want to remind the audience that at any time throughout tonight's presentation, please comment a question directed to Dr. Pratt in the comment section, and we will do our best to get through them at the end of the presentation. Before we dive into tonight's event, and before I introduce to you all Dr. Pratt, let's take a moment to start this night with some prayer. This is a prayer taken from the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops. We begin in the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Embracing Father, you grace each of us with equal measure in your love. Let us learn to love our neighbors more deeply, so that we can create peaceful and just communities. Inspire us to use our creative energies to build the structures we need to overcome the obstacles of intolerance and indifference. May Jesus provide us the example needed and send the Spirit to warm our hearts for the journey. Amen. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. All right, let's get started with tonight's presentation. I am honored to introduce Noelle Pratt, PhD. Dr. Pratt is the Director of Mission Engagement and Strategic Initiatives, Courtesy Assistant Professor of Sociology, and Editor-elect of the Journal of Catholic Social Thought at Villanova University. Dr. Pratt's research focuses on systematic racism in the Catholic Church and how it impacts the African American Catholic identity. Her work has been featured in the Interdisciplinary Journal of Research on Religion, multiple edited volumes, as well as Faithfully, Commonweal, The Revealer, National Catholic Reporter, and America Magazine. It's an honor to have Dr. Pratt speaking with us tonight. And without further ado, I introduce you to Dr. Pratt.
Hello.
Hello.
Thank you, Amanda, for that wonderful introduction. It is such a pleasure to be with you this evening virtually. Many years ago, maybe not that many, but many enough, I studied for a summer while I was an undergrad at Chapel Hill and had a chance to attend Mass at St. Thomas More while I was there. And it is a great pleasure to be with you virtually again after so many years. So tonight, let's see if I can share my screen with you, and then we will get started. Okay. Is that it? Can you see that? I hope you can. Okay. So tonight we're calling this, and Amanda, if there are any problems at all, please just interrupt me and let me know, and we'll figure it out. So tonight, I'm happy to share with you a talk that I'm calling Creating Our Own Narrative Through Research and the Black Catholics Syllabus. And as we get started, oh, no, I can't. Okay. Can you still see that? I hope so. Okay. So the focus of our time together tonight, I will talk about my approach to the work I do, to anti-Blackness, as well as my research and the Black Catholic syllabus, which I launched almost 2 years ago in June of 2020. Some of you will know that this very kind face belongs to Father Brian Massengale, and Father Massengale is a member of the Theology department at Fordham University. And back in 2017, Father Massengale gave the keynote address at the Ignatian Family Teach-In. And during that talk, he address the issue of being uncomfortable when talking about issues of race and racism in our church in particular. And he said, it ain't going to be easy having these conversations. When we have these adult conversations about race, people may feel uncomfortable. And that really is an approach that I take to my work, that we have to be ready to be uncomfortable. We have to be ready to make others uncomfortable. And it's important that we allow ourselves to be in that space of discomfort and creating discomfort, because that's really the only way that those who live with marginalization can create our own narrative. And it is only in creating our own narrative that we can break these systemic cycles of marginalization and really move the needle where it needs to go, and that is towards justice. So, really since early 2020, we have seen, I'm okay. Can you see that? I hope you can. All right. Okay. So, okay. And since early 2020, I'll just go back for a moment just to share with you that this very kind face that I mentioned a minute ago of Father Massengale and the things that I mentioned a minute ago. Okay. So now here we go. All right. All right. No, my PowerPoint is not working. Okay. All right. I am so sorry that we're having this trouble. This is incredibly rare for me to have this kind of trouble. All right. Well, we'll go like this. Okay. So since early 2020, we have seen, a global pandemic, the murder of George Floyd, which sparked a global reckoning around issues of systemic racism, not just in our country, but around the world. And the church is not immune to that. And we really have moved the conversation where it needs to go, in that we must listen to those who have been ignored. And I highlight these themes in my own work. And it looks like my PowerPoint is not as fancy as I would like it, but that's okay as long as we can all see it. Okay. So, and so we need to begin really with this idea of anti-Blackness and anti-racism. And, anti-Blackness being a very particular form of racism, and requiring us to engage in the work of anti-racism in order to break down those structures that do so much harm, not only in our society and but in our church. And in doing this work, it allows us to create a narrative that centers the marginalized. And that truly is the only way that we're going to move towards justice, towards the kind of space that benefits all of us. And in doing that, one of the things that we need to really think closely about is some of the ways that we use different language interchangeably, but really means different things, like the language of race relations, racial justice, and anti-racism. The language of race relations is really an interpersonal model that focuses on that person-to-person racism. That's the racism of racist graffiti and using racial slurs and the racism of that happens at an individual level. And when we focus on that paradigm, what it does is it allows those who don't engage in that behavior to say these things have nothing to do with me, when in reality it has everything to do with all of us, but not always in the same ways. And so from there, we have the racial justice paradigm, and the racial justice model really allows us to see how these things work in a systemic fashion, how they work at the societal level. But even that's not enough, because it's not enough to acknowledge that these structures exist. If we truly want justice, then we have to be able to break down those racist structures and rebuild them in a model that is based on equity and justice. And that's really where the work of anti-racism happens. But in order to do that, we have to understand and we have to break through anti-Blackness as a very specific form of racism, a form that sociologists have called a form of racism informed by white supremacist ideologies centered on the particular devaluation and exploitation of Black persons and is embedded in institutions, organizations, cultures, and so on. And this way of thinking about anti-Blackness allows us really to see how we can look at anti-Blackness as something that happens not just a long time ago, but something that really happens in all facets of our social lives and the social world even today. And when we talk about anti-Blackness, we need to think about that and remember that as truly being rooted in slavery, but exemplified in numerous social structures, politics. I mean, think about in politics how, we're still talking about so many firsts. It's not that long ago we had our first Black president. We currently have our first Black vice president. We just this week got our first Black woman nominated to the Supreme Court. Just the fact that there are so many firsts for Black folks still happening in our society tells us just how deeply embedded in our social structures anti-Blackness is. So, and we can talk about this in all manner of social structures and societal institutions, the military, education, the way anti-Blackness was written into the laws of our society, codified in Jim Crow. And the church is not immune to this either. My former colleague at Villanova, who's now at University of Dayton, Dr. Shannon D. Williams, has discussed in her work the church as the largest corporate slave owner in the Americas. And, when you think about, the Jesuits, the Vincentians, and so many other religious congregations and individual bishops and Catholic institutions that either owned slaves outright or benefited from slavery through either the slave labor of others, or when they came into the possession of slaves, selling them right away and keeping the money and using the money to shore up their own institutions. And that is something that we have not reckoned with enough, but that day is coming. As far as the church goes as well, the denial of access to the priesthood and religious life for African Americans, which went on for so long, or refusing admission to Catholic colleges and universities. My colleague at Villanova, Dr. Katie Grimes, who is a theologian, writes about anti-Blackness in the church in her work. And these things are still with us in the sense that the ramifications of what this means for African American Catholics is still very much a part of our church. Whether we are in the Archdiocese of Philadelphia, where I am, or the Diocese of Raleigh, where you are. I mean, there are so many examples in our parishes and in our schools of how this has manifested, and the consequences of it are still with us. And so that brings us to the great Nobel laureate and Roman Catholic, Toni Morrison, who said, if you can only be tall because somebody's on their knees, then you have a serious problem. And we need to confront the ways that our church has put Black people on their knees. And tonight, I'd like to share a bit with you about some ways that I do this in my work, and particularly in the research that I do on African American Catholics and African American Catholic identity, and particularly how that works through liturgy. So I am finishing up a book that right now I'm calling Faithful and Devoted: Racism and Identity in the African American Catholic Experience. And that book uses a number of different research techniques in order to really get at the heart of the racism that we see and experience in the church, and the ramifications of that. So I incorporate historical analysis, participant observation, in-depth interviews. And one of the things that I'm trying to do, I'm trying to do a lot with this project, but one of the things I'm trying to do is push back against this lingering myth that being Black and Catholic are not compatible, that there are no Black Catholics. Some of you might be surprised how often people say to me that they're surprised that there are Black Catholics at all, or what few Black Catholics there are only trace their origins to conversions that took place after World War II. And none of that is true. There have been people of African descent who have been Catholic as long as there have been Catholics. Some of the earliest Christian communities were on the African continent. So this is something that is deeply embedded into the history of the church. I mean, there were Black Catholics in the United States before the United States even existed. And one of the things that I do to make these points is really to connect the dots of systemic racism. And in doing that, what I do is show that what is happening, say, in Baltimore, that the same things are happening in Chicago at the same time, and in Philadelphia and in New York and places across the country, which shows the systemic nature of this racism, and that it's not limited to a few bad actors in one place. So in addition to that, I examine contemporary parish life through a number of interviews, and also liturgy as a form of identity work, really highlighting music, preaching, and church aesthetics, and how all of that comes together as really an active resistance to racism in the church, particularly the piece on liturgy, because if we belong to a church that dismisses the gifts of Blackness, to really celebrate and incorporate and turn the volume up on Blackness in mass, that in and of itself is an act of resistance to racism. And that happens in some key ways right here. So I like to say when I use this chart that as a qualitative researcher who does a lot of interviews. Having a chart is something that's quite rare. So I'm very proud of this chart. And so as I said a moment ago, I focus on really three key areas of Mass: music, preaching, and church aesthetics. And what I've found is what I call the traditionalist style, the spirited style, and the gospel style of liturgy. And that traditionalist Mass is that 45-minute Mass that we all know and love, that has standard hymns, if there are hymns at all, a shorter homily. That spirited Mass is just that. It's a little more spirited. The music is a little more lively. The preaching is a little more lively, and the gospel Mass is exactly what you would think a gospel Mass would be, that where there's so much emphasis on the music, on the preaching, and that emphasis on bringing that historic and very tangible Black experience into the space of liturgy. And in doing that, it allows me also to look at issues of race, space, and place. And I do this by focusing on uh, Black parishes and how Black parishes came into being. I mean, there are two key ways that predominantly Black parishes came into being. Those parishes that are specifically created as such, like St. Peter Claver in Philadelphia, really St. Peter Claver anywhere, along with so many other parishes, or uh, parishes that developed into predominantly Black parishes through neighborhood changes, and that accompany the collapse of the national parish model in the mid 20th century. And with that in mind and how this works in parishes, I want to share with you a bit about St. Peter Claver in Philadelphia. And as I share this with you, I invite you to think about the parishes that you have known, whether in your diocese or another diocese, that you have lived in another part of your life, or a diocese that you are familiar with, because I highlight St. Peter Claver because the story of St. Peter Claver is not unique. And that, again, is part of the systemic issues that are facing our church and that we must reckon with if we are to move the needle towards justice. And so with that in mind, I'd like to introduce you to St. Peter Claver. And if you are familiar with Philadelphia at all, you may recognize this as the southwest corner of 12th and Lombard. And for many years, this was the home of the St. Peter Claver parish community. The church has been shuttered now for quite some time, but we will get into that as we progress. The story of St. Peter Claver begins officially in 1886, when Black Catholics came together under the name of Peter Claver Union. And the members of Peter Claver Union, worshipped often in people's homes, like their early Christian forebears, and they were faithful and devoted. And even though they experienced such hardship in just the simple and profound practice of celebrating their faith. And St. Peter Claver was the first Catholic church in Philadelphia designated for ministry to Black Catholics. And this parish was so needed because Black Catholics faced segregated communion lines. They faced pew fees. They faced being banned from parishes that existed in the surrounding community. They would sometimes the members of Peter Claver Union would be allowed to worship at a church that was in this general vicinity for a few weeks, a few months, a year, but then they would be told to go. So they had this nomadic existence that compelled them to gather in homes for prayer and worship, because they really had nowhere else to do it. And these kinds of systemic discrimination, Black folks faced everywhere they went. But for Catholics in particular, church on Sunday didn't provide a respite the way that it did for our brothers and sisters in the historically Black Christian denominations. And so as the parish community of St. Peter Claver came together officially, they needed a church home. And this location at 12th and Lombard was a prime location. The neighborhood in the late 19th century, in those last years of the 19th century, had transitioned and become heavily African American. And you may have noticed that the church building is not this grand stone edifice that we might liken to Northeastern churches, especially those in big cities. And that's because it wasn't built to be a Catholic church. It was built to be Fourth Presbyterian Church of Philadelphia. And Fourth Presbyterian had followed its members into West Philadelphia, and that's why the church building was available. And so the members of Peter Claver Union, now St. Peter Claver Parish, did so much work. I mean, these are people who did not have much by way of financial means, but they managed to pull together more than 80% of the cost of purchasing the building. Yet, at the parishes for the history of the parish written for its 75th anniversary, credit for purchasing the church building was given to St. Catherine Drexel, the Holy Ghost Fathers, Archbishop Ryan, who was Archbishop of Philadelphia at the time, and a benefactor who was head of a local bank named Patrick Quinn, and only gives passing reference to the Black parishioners who, as according to the history, whose loyalty and sacrifice made St. Peter Claver possible. And to have their effort erased in that way was really the cost of having the church, because Archbishop Ryan wouldn't consecrate the church, wouldn't send priests to minister to them at the church unless the name Peter Claver Union was removed from the deed. But what they got in exchange was, one, to have their church in the first place, but second was protective language in the deed that said St. Peter Claver would always be used for the benefit of Black Catholics in Philadelphia. And that protective language is key and would become a matter of great importance in the years to come. But this erasure of the effort of those original parishioners to found their parish, to have a church home so that they could come together in peace, to worship and to celebrate their faith. I mean, this erasure is what happens when somebody else writes our stories. And this is why creating our own narrative is so important. But as we move on in the story of St. Peter Claver, by the 1980s, the neighborhood was changing again. And even though the word gentrification wouldn't come along for some time, gentrification was on the horizon. And I have this picture here because I want to point out to you that this picture is of a parking garage, a multi-use building, which is a parking garage on the top and retail space on the ground level. The kind of structure that is pretty common now, but in the 1980s, when this was built, it was pretty sophisticated. It was pretty revolutionary. I mean, these kinds of things didn't really exist to the extent that they do now. And in the foreground, we see this lovely playground for the children that live in the neighborhood. And this neighborhood is one that is notorious for not having places to park. And so the idea to have this parking garage, does the parking garage, was it a response to the changes in the neighborhood, or did it bring about the changes in the neighborhood? That's something that is honestly beyond the scope of my research, but posing the question is important as we think about what happens to St. Peter Claver as the years continue and as the 20th century starts to come to an end. And this location is 2 blocks away from St. Peter Claver, and really is a majorly indicative of what is happening in the neighborhood. And so as the 80s progress, the Archdiocese of Philadelphia commissions a report on what's happening in the neighborhood, the state of the parish, and what really can be done or should be done as the years move on. And so that report is known as the Sites and Boundaries Report. And it was released in April of 1984. It recommended keeping St. Peter Claver open because the church was financially viable, particularly because the school had recently closed. The church was within what was called the urban renewal area of Washington Square West, which is that neighborhood at 12th and Lombard. The report also said that St. Peter Claver has real symbolic significance for Black Catholics in Philadelphia, and that they might feel abandoned if the church were to close. And the report also said that the issue of protective language may lead to unpleasant complications should St. Peter Claver close. And that point about unpleasant complications is important for us to consider when we think about what happened next. So, in May 1985, the parish was suppressed. There was a letter read at Mass on a Sunday morning in May, and the parishioners had no clue that this was coming, that this was their last Sunday, their last day at their church. And many of the St. Peter Claver parishioners were the children and grandchildren of the original parishioners who bought and opened the church in the late 1800s. So the parish suppression triggered a long court fight, which ended in Orphans Court in 2017. Orphans Court being that the court in Philadelphia that has jurisdiction over these matters. And with that court case coming to its conclusion in 2017, the protective language was interpreted to allow for the sale of the property. But an appeal was filed by a group called the Advocates and Descendants of St. Peter Claver. And what that means is that the story of St. Peter Claver is not over, that an appeal has been filed to the Vatican to try and maintain the history and the legacy and the building of St. Peter Claver, so that what these African American Catholics went through, just for as I said, for the simple but profound act of being able to practice their faith, isn't lost. But what happens now is, we have to think about the loss of our churches, the loss of sacred spaces, and what that means, and how that impacts racial minorities, the poor, those who are already marginalized, those that we need to listen to, but often aren't listened to. And really, in the end, we have to think about how an institution can't continue to marginalize people and expect those people to be active in the institution. It just doesn't work that way. Um, and especially as we now know that, and especially with information moving so quickly, it is far easier for us to see the patterns of institutions marginalizing particular groups. And that allows those groups to mobilize, to vocalize their discontent, and to push the institutions towards justice. So, you know, those who work towards an anti-racist church, we must realize that not everyone will want to be a part of that conversation. And in fact, some will actively thwart it. Those are the folks that I call the unconvincibles, those that bemoan wokeness or who equate Catholicism, anything Catholic or Catholicism, with whiteness, or say that anti-racism isn't Catholic, when in reality, anti-racism and the work of justice, there really isn't anything more Catholic, that is more of an exercise of our faith and of our gospel values than this work. Those who be mindful of those who say, oh, we really should focus on all the positive things, because those folks, what they're really saying is, slavery ended, why can't y'all just be happy? Don't fall for that. And as Father Massengale said in a different talk about a year ago, the church will only go to the limits of white comfort, and we need to be mindful of that as well. And that's where the point about causing discomfort and being comfortable in discomfort that I talked about at the very beginning of our time together this evening, why that is so essential. And we also have to think about how dialogue is not a useful exercise with those who are not open to a new perspective. Because then, if that's the case, we would get more out of just talking to the wall. And we know that's not productive anyway. So, doing the work of anti-racism, and I have it capitalized here purposely, because the work of anti-racism is so important that we have to think about it in capital letters. And it must happen in all facets of church life: our chancery offices, congregational leadership, congregational membership, board leadership of our nonprofits, our schools and education settings, parish life, and how we approach problems and struggles like the sex abuse crisis, and that's not over. It's not over because we're at the cusp, at the precipice of that reckoning happening in a new way. I'm sure you have heard about and been following what has been happening in Canada in terms of church-run residential facilities for Indigenous children in Canada. That reckoning is on the way to happening in the United States. Secretary of the Interior, Deb Haaland, has already issued an investigation. She's ordered an investigation into these residential facilities in the United States. And that reckoning, when it comes, will be long overdue. And all of this means that we must push the church beyond the limits of white comfort, because it's the only way we'll get to where we need to go. And in some of the on the ground work that I do with various nonprofits and the archdiocese, what I hear too often is, well, we want Black people, we just can't find any. That's not an answer. If you can't find any, then that just means that you need to look in a different way. Doing things the way that we've been doing them for 50 years, 100 years, will only produce the same results. If we want different results, we have to do things in a different way. And so How do we get started? Well, one way we get started is through the Black Catholic Syllabus. As I said earlier, the syllabus was launched in June of 2020, and I began this work because I felt very strongly that the period of history that we are all living in right now calls each of us to concrete action. And the syllabus is a collection of resources related to Black Catholics in the United States. It's intended for academics, journalists, educators, diocesan institutions, parishes, congregations of women and men religious, and the general public. In short, everybody. And it prioritizes the work of Blacks in order to center the voice of Black Catholics in the creation of our own narrative. And I was hoping to kind of show you on the website what it looks like, but given our technical difficulties earlier, I won't try that. But it is there at tiapratt.com, and you can find it easily. So what happens now? We must keep up the fight for justice by doing the work, actively resist the racism that plagues our church. And that means getting into trouble, what Congressman John Lewis called, good trouble, necessary trouble. My very dear friend, Sister Cora Marie Billings, taught me how to get in trouble. Sister Cora Marie is originally from Philadelphia, but she's been in the Diocese of Richmond for many years now. And, I really see this work as the modern day overturning of the money changers tables. That's where I take my lead in terms of gospel teachings that have compelled me to do this work. And when we center our own stories, it means that others don't create our narrative. It means we're able to do that for ourselves. And one more thing that we're doing, a shameless plug, Villanova has designated one of its graduate resident minister fellowships as the Sister Cora Marie Billings Fellowship. And what that does is it supports a lay Black Catholic in the completion of a master's degree in ministry and theology at Villanova. And what that does is it really, we're training a next generation of leaders to follow Sister Cora Marie's example as an educator, as a parish leader, and diocesan official. So there's much more information on that on Villanova's website, villanova.edu/residential ministry. So please tell your friends about that. So I'll end with inviting you to think about a question that I often pose at the end of conversations like this. The question, what do I know now that I didn't know before? And with that, I will share the screen. I will stop sharing the screen, and hopefully we can get back to okay. How's that?
Wonderful. That was so wonderful. Thank you, Dr. Pratt, for that amazing presentation and all of your wisdom. We really appreciate it. And I also wanted to say that I've linked your website and more information about Black Catholic Syllabus in the comments, so please feel free to click those to see more information about those.
Mm-hmm.
But now is the portion of the night where we will shift into addressing questions from the audience. So this is also a reminder that if you have any questions, please put them in the Facebook comments and we will do our best to get to them at the end of the presentation. So our first question of the night is, how has your expertise in sociology helped form your theological research?
So, okay, that's a great question. So, my work, I'm trained as a sociologist. I am a sociologist. The research I do is sociological research. It is that I'm trained as a sociologist of religion, and so I study systemic racism in the church from a sociological point of view, and with sociological training and methodology and all of that. but yes, all of that is informed by so much of work in theology. The work of Father Massengale, the work of Professor Sean Copeland, the work of Professor Jamie Phelps, as well as the historical research done by the late Father Cyprian Davis, among so many others. Um, so I'm not trained as a theologian. I'm not a theologian. I'm a sociologist. But the work that I do is very much informed by the theological work of those scholars I mentioned, as well as others.
Awesome. Thank you for that. Can you talk about how church aesthetics contribute to racism and or anti-racism? And what are some examples?
Sure, sure. Thanks for that question. So, in terms of church aesthetics, there was a church that I visited and did some research at several years ago, and one great example is the church is a very old church, probably about 150 years old at this point, and it was built to be the church of uh, the German Catholic community in Philadelphia. But the neighborhood has changed a lot, and now it's a predominantly Black church. But one of the things that they do is, the frescoes on the walls are of white Jesus, but the crucifix at the altar servers carry at the beginning and end of Mass, that is Black Jesus. Um, at During Advent, the parish had the Advent wreath at the front of the church, and right next to that was a Kwanzaa kinara, and so to have those uh, those examples of Blackness and celebrating Blackness right next to those key symbols of and celebrations of Catholicism really helped. And during Black History Month, one of the things that the church would do is, I guess the best way to describe it is those posters with key folks from that we hear about in Black history, that you often see it in schools, in elementary schools in particular. Well, they would have them around the church, Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King and Jackie Robinson and Jesse Owens, all those folks. And so to bring that into church, to bring especially those leaders and figures that are from civil society and not really associated with religion in a specific way, are those are some key ways that aesthetics are really part of anti-racism and combating anti-Blackness. um in terms of how aesthetics can contribute to racism in the church, you know uh, that can happen, when leadership doesn't read the room, when leadership, you know just leaves the church as it was 150 years ago, and not realizing that, Black folks, Latinx folks, Asian American folks, whoever is in that community, that they are there now, and that their experiences of church and of Catholicism need to be represented as well.
Thank you for that answer. And that transitions beautifully to our next question. St. Thomas More has a very large Latinx population. And so the question is, how would you connect Black Catholics' history with current Hispanic Catholics that are also looking for a place in the U.S. Catholic Church?
Yeah, and this is an important part of the conversation. And one of the things that I will say kind of upfront is, this is not necessarily work that I'm going to do. is work that I'm going to encourage and empower others to do. That said, in terms of parish closings and aesthetics and racism and all of these things that I talk about in my work, these things are not exclusive to African Americans, and these issues are not at all. And that's something that I I, I try to forefront um, as much as possible. And while concentrating on the work that I'm here to do, but also acknowledging that there's other work to do as well. And so, our Latinx scholars are doing wonderful work in this area, and that work needs to be celebrated. In terms of what happens at the diocesan level in terms of our schools and our churches, those things, it is so important for dioceses to recognize that all of these things are part of what happens in the church, and that we don't do enough to recognize that the small c Catholicity in our big C Catholic Church.
Thank you for that answer. That was beautiful. Our next question is about your upcoming book, Faithful and Devoted. What have you found most surprising in your research?
Yeah, what have I found most surprising? I think what I found most surprising, I want to say just digging into the archives around what happened to the people of St. Peter Claver in their efforts to maintain their church. But I really wasn't surprised. I had already been doing this long enough to not be surprised. So I think I was more stunned than surprised. It's one thing to connect the dots as you're doing the work. It's one thing. It's another to be standing in a library and with these dusty banker's boxes of dusty papers and wearing white gloves and only using a pencil because archivists are very particular about that sort of thing, and rightly so. And seeing it in kind of in black and white on pages, how these people were treated, how their church was treated, and even what's happening now. That church, that huge property that is a church, a school, a rectory that sits on a corner that is prime real estate and a highly desirable area for development in the city of Philadelphia. And new housing that's directly across the street. Condos are selling for $1 million a unit. So there's a lot at stake with what happens to Peter Claver.
Our next question discusses how you talked about centering our own stories and how that leads to creating our own narratives. How would you inspire confidence in someone to center their own story? Or how could we create a culture to influence confidence in others to create their own stories?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you for that question. I think a great way to inspire confidence is to listen. And to listen effectively, we have to stop talking. You can't listen effectively if you're talking all the time. Think of the people that you know who are great listeners. They are great listeners because they don't talk all the time. And as church, if we want to inspire the confidence to tell for folks to tell their stories and to create their own narrative and center their own experiences. We have to create a venue and a space for that to happen. And we just need to shut up and let that happen, and let folks be able to share those experiences and to connect those dots, because the sharing of experiences, the telling of the stories, that's important, but that's not the end. That's only the first step. The end is to take all of that pain, all of that trauma, and use it to create change, so that the generational trauma that so many have experienced ends. Where does that cycle end? We have to decide at church that it ends here.
Awesome. And then this will be our last question of the night. How does studying and looking at Black history connect to cultivating a culture of racial healing?
Oh, wow, that's a wonderful question. So many great questions tonight. Thank you all so much. You know, this leads to or helps create a culture of racial healing because we're able to stop the erasure. I talked, you saw that I talked about the erasure of the work of those initial first parishioners of St. Peter Claver in the sacrifice required to buy their church. Acknowledging first that they put up the majority of the money to buy the church, and acknowledging that the fact that they put up that money was erased from the history for so long. That's where we start to have healing. So it's not just uh, acknowledging the history. We also have to acknowledge the erasure of the history. And those two things have to happen before we can have healing. But that second one, that's the one that's really hard. It's really hard for those who did it to admit that they did it, but it has to happen.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Pratt. That's all the time that we have for Q&A for tonight, but I want to extend a huge thank you to Dr. Pratt for taking the time to give this wonderful presentation to the Catholic community of St. Thomas More. We are so grateful for your wisdom, your passion, and your testimony in shedding light on the beauty and importance of celebrating our Black history, as well as all that you've done for the Catholic community and beyond. So thank you so much, Dr. Pratt. It's been an honor. And once your book comes out, you'll have to swing by St. Thomas More as part of the tour.
I would love to. And thank you so much for inviting me. And it's been a pleasure to be with you tonight.
Appreciate it. Have a good night.
You too.
And thank you to all who have joined us tonight, wherever you may be. This month represents Black History Month, but may we continue to celebrate and honor the treasure of America's Black history outside of this month. This event is brought to you by the Image and Likeness Committee at St. Thomas More, and the videos will be available on YouTube as well as Facebook. Please know St. Thomas More's prayers for you all, and have a great rest of your Monday night. Good night.